All right, let's get 9.5, solving using the quadratic formula. We have three basic steps. Step 3, we've got to go a little further. We're going to sub in and then solve. But first step is write in standard form. You'll hear me say it 1,000 times before you're out of my class, just this year, much less next year in Algebra 2. To write it in standard form, the standard form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This lesson will show us more of why we want it to be ax squared plus bx plus c than any other lesson we've done. Second step is to identify the value of a, b, and c. A always needs to be positive. That's what a greater than 0 means. This means that this number needs to be positive. If it happened to be a negative, I could just multiply both sides by -1. That would still be 0, but it would change all the signs on this side and make it positive. And then we're going to substitute those values into the quadratic formula. All right, so for us to be able to substitute them into the quadratic formula, we need to know what the quadratic formula is. It's going to look intimidating at first, but once you've done this, probably by the end of this lesson, it won't be nearly as intimidating. You'll have it memorized. It doesn't feel like you'll have it memorized at first, but you will. The quadratic formula is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. All right, so you'll say that so many times that you'll know it by name, about like the back of your hand. You'll know it well. All right, so this is the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula, all it's really doing is we're solving without factoring. So all the quadratics we've done so far, we had to factor one way or another. We factored by finding the greatest common factor. We did it by completing the square. We did it by the difference of perfect squares, determining whether it was a PST, and by trial and error. So we've tried all those different ways of factoring it. Using the quadratic formula is not factoring. So anytime it says solve by factoring, really the quadratic formula is not an option at that point. But when it just says to solve, you can use the quadratic formula or factor, whichever way you like best, as long as it's not telling you to do it a specific way. In this case, every problem we do in 9.5, we could also solve by doing what we did in 9.4 of completing the square. They both will get the exact same answers as long as you do them both the correct way. It's just sometimes you'll find it easier to use the quadratic formula. Sometimes you may find it easier to use completing the square. All right, so let's talk about what this is going to look like. If I have the quadratic 2x squared minus 5x equals -2. Step 1, write it in standard form. Standard form should always be equal to 0. This is not equal to 0, so I need to move that constant. I move it to the other side by doing the inverse operation. The opposite of subtracting is adding, so those cancel out. This side I get 2x squared minus 5x plus 2 equals 0. It is now in standard form. Number 2, identify the values of a, b, and c, and this is why this lesson we start to really see why it's a, b, and c in the standard form of a quadratic. In this case, a is equal to +2. Again, if that had been negative, I would just multiply everything by -1, distribute it through, do the same thing over here, that would have changed it to positive. In this case, it is positive, so I can just round it. It's 2. A is equal to 2. B is equal to -5. I've got to make sure I include that sign. -5. C is +2. So I've identified the values of a, b, and c, making sure that a is positive. 3 is to substitute those values into the quadratic formula. So I'm going to take this formula and I'm going to rewrite it using these values. The way I generally do it, I do this so I don't accidentally mess up on my squaring of b. I always rewrite it as negative, I know this is going to be b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. All right, so you can write the b and a and the c on all of them. You'll do it enough, you get used to it. Negative b. b is negative 5. This one should be a b also. b squared. b is negative 5. A for the next one is 2. C for the next one is also 2. And then A down here is a 2. Alright, so this is B, B, A, C, A. Negative B plus or minus the square root of negative B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. The parentheses help a lot right here. If I don't have the parentheses, I have to remember that negative 5 squared is not equal to negative 5 squared, because this one is negative 25 and this one is positive 25, because negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25, negative 5 times 5 is negative 25. That's why I write it in parentheses every time. When I go to simplify, negative is going to be positive. Double negative is positive. Plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared is positive 25. Minus 4 times 2 is 8 times 2 is 16. All over 2 times 2 is 4. Now I'm going to simplify. 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 16 is 9 over 4. That equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3 over 4. So we talked about with the quadratic, I'll always get 2 answers. Right here is where I've got 2 answers. I've got 5 plus 3 over 4 and I've got 5 minus 3 over 4. So I'm going to break those apart. 5 plus 3 over 4 and 5 minus 3 over 4. I get 5 plus 3 is 8 over 4, which equals 2. And 5 minus 3 over 4 is 2 over 4, which equals 1/2. So I got the answers, x equals 1/2 and 2. All right, you would have got that same thing if you would have factored using completing the square right there. All right, so that is the quadratic formula. You don't have to do a lot of examples because it's going to be the same every time. The biggest opportunity to make mistakes is in the basic math. What do you do under here? Do you put the right values in the right spot? And then do you simplify the way you should? You're not dealing with a whole lot of x's here. You're not having to factor. It's really probably, for most people, the easiest way to do it once they get the hang of it. But you can only do it whenever it says to solve using the quadratic formula, or when it just says solve and it doesn't exclude factoring from that, the means to solving. Right, so that should get you through 9.5.